Hi, I'm Dr. Lopez, and I'm here to talk to you about becoming an effective policy advocate. In particular, I want to take a look into Johnson's chapter 3 entitled Surmounting Cynicism by Developing Policy Advocacy Skills. What I would like to highlight today is a policy making framework for understanding social policy. Immediately, one question to ask is, how does the policy making process work? How do we understand the response of government officials? So let's start off with understanding the policy context. We need to think about the outside influences that are taking place that impact the policymaking process. So for example, when we think about events such as 9/11, the terrorist attack, or Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, or let's take a look at something like the development, of the Social Security Act in 1935. So if you look at the context, the crash on Wall Street, the economic depression coupled with a major drought, the Dust Bowl, unemployment was rising, and it called for bold action. And if you strip away these events, you wouldn't really understand the context of why the policy took place, why it was developed as it was, and without understanding the context, it would be hard to understand why this policy is important. So we also need to understand the importance of stakeholders. Stakeholders are persons with a vested interest in a specific policy or issue being contested. And it's more than just a beneficiary or recipient of the program or policy. It's also people interested or at stake of the development of the policy. So it's important that we understand the breadth of stakeholders as we look at policy development, because it is from the stakeholders that we are going to get the support or perhaps some resistance as we try to initiate, modify, change, or terminate a specific policy. So stakeholders are a broad group of people, from the leaders of advocacy and special interest groups, program administrators, legislators, head of government, political parties, governmental agencies, consumers, beneficiaries, regulatory bodies, and courts, professional groups, corporate interest, union leaders, community representative, agency clients. So again, it's a very broad group of people. So let's use as an example the Food Stamp Act of 1963. So what's interesting and that the legislative attempt for this policy, they make some statements about the effective, economical, and efficient distribution for the abundance of American food stuff. And when later it talks about feeding the hungry. So what's interesting to me is, what did the first statement really talk about? It got me thinking about, was it a commodity program where people would get beans and flour and rice, canned meat, lard, and would go home and make the food for their family? But as we moved later on, we saw the rise of supermarkets, the marketing of prepackaged foods. Companies such as Pillsbury were bringing and milling the into flour, but now they were becoming a large agribusiness that took the raw product and made it into prepackaged food, and their profit margin became a lot greater. So one of the issues then became, how do we get 44 million people to go into the supermarket and buy hamburger helper and other prepackaged foods? So the solution was looking at food stamps as a way to move from commodity and getting people to use the food stamps coupons, and it's now morphed into a SNAP program. So you now have the electronic debit cards, and you have things that everyone else buys. It wasn't this this poverty program where the focus was on poor and on the hungry. You get the sense that it wasn't the primary driver of the Food Stamp Act. So it helps you when you get into this kind of analysis, because you think about the stakeholders and their vested interest. So if you want to make changes to a policy, for example, if you want to make a change to the SNAP program, you obviously need to think about the agribusiness. So it's going to be large. They're going to have a large, very important role in the process of making this policy. So that's why it is important to take into consideration the context of the policy, as well as identifying who the stakeholders are, and then to take a look at who the policy initiators are. So who are the policy initiators? They're people or groups that initiate a change in existing policy. So basically, if they're who propose or modify or terminate a policy, and we can begin to look at who participates in policy deliberations. And first of all, a lot of us are bystanders, and we take no part at all in the policy deliberations until something happens that we don't want. Then we tend to get involved. So we can take a look at policy responders that seek to modify or change the proposal of the initiators. So if there's something we see that we don't like, we respond to it. So for example, this happens when a policy is introduced that people don't like. Then we see people protesting or lobbying groups advocating to change, to modify, or to stop the policy. So that's why, so it is very important to participate in the process. It's important for you to see how one can impact legislation as it is being developed, and we should not wait until the night before the final vote is in the legislation. It's important to get involved in the legislative process before bills are even filed. So, you know, you get to file it, and it goes to the system, and then you watch the progress as it goes through legislation. Okay, so the 8th task of policy practitioners. First, we need to think about, you know, what's right or what's wrong. So this is the first thing we need to do as we apply the ethical screen. And you learn this back in MSW 500, where you learn to look at the ethical screen. And basically what you do is you think, is this right or wrong? Is it the right or wrong thing to do? What are the ethics involved? The second task is navigating the policy and advocacy system. So here it is important to decide where the focus and position of your policy intervention is. This is something very important. You work as you start writing your letters to legislators, for example. So whether, I guess, whether it be to the editor or to an elected official, so you need to take a look at what you want to do and what you are proposing, and then where the change should take place. So is the policy that you're interested in, is it a city, state, or federal level? So for example, if you want to write a letter to a state senator regarding federal issues, this person may not be able to do as much, and they will probably have a small impact. So it is important that you identify what level does a change need to take place, and then who are the particular people involved, who are the actors, who are the stakeholders, the important people who will bring about the change. The third task has to do with the agenda setting. This is where we want to start to look to see if the context is favorable for the policy initiative. So one of the things we can do is to look over time to look at the context context. So let's say we're looking at same-sex marriage and same-sex marital rights. At one point, that could have never taken place that because the context wasn't favorable. But then when Obama got rid of the don't ask, don't tell policy in the military, it became, this became possible after some judicial decisions that now increasingly made those policies not look like they would meet a judicial task of constitutionality. So it provided a favorable context to do away with this policy that 10 years earlier, it would not have been possible to do because of the environment would not have been favorable. Problem analyzing is task number 4. It's important to look at the causes, prevalence, nature of a specific problem. So where does it occur? Who does it impact? This is where you really have to understand how big is a particular problem. Is it really something that is meriting a focus? I remember times talking if we were going to, so for example, when we talk in agencies about developing a program, you know, we can think about, so for example, is this a good program? So if we're thinking, for example, about developing a hospital, pediatric hospital for HIV, AIDS, or babies who have HIV AIDS, but if we look at the entire state and maybe we only have about 5 babies who meet the criteria, would it be worthwhile to propose a 10 million program for these babies? Or would it make more sense to designate a hospital without building anything to provide some expertise with these cases and to direct people to provide that expertise to them? So that would be far cheaper, far more economical, more cost effective than developing a new program. So in this case, it is very important to look at the size. How many does it impact? Who's impacted and where do they live? This also becomes one of the issues when treating veterans and whether or not we allow veterans to have services from community doctors. And part of the issue is that when you look at the geographic locations of veterans, medical facilities are often not very convenient to where the veterans may be living. In this task, that's where you want to focus on causes, nature, prevalence of a problem. Where does it exist and where is the specific solution? Task number 5 is proposal writing. Is it going to be a piece of legislation? Is it going to be ambitious? Are we talking about like modest changes? Are we talking about incremental changes? Then it is policy enacting, and you work through the process of getting it approved. Here you develop a legislative strategy to get it enacted in the legislation, and you work also to implement it. So once it is enacted, how do you actually enact the legislation? How do you carry out or develop the program? There can be tremendous conflict at this point once it's implemented. Then last, how do we assess it? How do we evaluate it? Did it do as we wanted it to do? Did it meet our objectives? These are the tasks that are important to understand. Sometimes we engage on these tasks several times. Sometimes they're not accomplished sequentially or predictably. So again, that's I talked about policy implementing, about carrying it out, and then assessing it to see whether it is working or not. So what then are the skills to carry out those tasks? So an important skill are analytic skills, talking about the importance of how we analyze problems to develop our critical thinking skills and to think, how do social problems develop? Who do they impact? What's the severity? What are the barriers to implementation? What are the strategies to assessing programs? Those are all examples of analytic skills. Certainly, political power It's also important. How do we gain and use political power? How do we implement a political strategy? And then also interactional skills. How do we interact with task groups, committees? How do we help other people and persuade them to support us? And value clarifying skills, skills to identify and rank relevant principles when engaging in policy practice. So those becomes the task and skills that, and then, you know, how those skills relate to competencies. So policy competencies. So if you run for a position, do you understand the political process, such as donating time, resources, and resources to an advocacy group, registering voters? Those all become examples of political competencies. Being willing to get involved in the political system becomes very important. Relational competencies. How do you reach out to people? How do you build coalitions? How do you become a good team leader, a task manager? How well do you manage conflict? Those are some of the interpersonal competencies that are important. Value clarifying skills or competencies, I'm sorry. Where do you use a knowledge of the ethical principles? When do you use your ethical reasoning to work through and understand what it is that we are talking about? So those become important tasks, skills, as well as competency. So this chapter also talks about different styles of competency. So social movement style. So this is when there is a need to increase pressure on legislators and government officials, as well as police departments or other government agencies to make major reforms. So for example, to change their way of interacting with African Americans. So you can use public protest, lobbying, and other types of grassroots movements. Electoral style. So for example, electoral style, how do you get involved in a campaign? How do you go out and initiate or contest a ballot initiative? This is getting to the right people, getting the right people elected into office, and it becomes a real key to electoral style. So legislative advocacy style. So the goal is to secure enactment of meritorious legislation, and you can use advocacy groups, community-based organizations, and other professional associations and lobbyists. So you, again, the main goal is to work through the legislative process and make an impact in the legislative process. Analytic style is being good at developing policy proposals. That's very useful in terms of agency leadership, academic units, or governmental agency. So it's important that we communicate what are the key policy proposals, what are the existing policies working for us or not working, and how do we do a better job evaluating the impact of policies. This becomes very important. So as we think about applying the policy task and skills, we need to think about that, this is not a black or white. We need to use a combination of the 4 skills and together with the 8 tasks. So for example, policy advocates can use analytic and political skills to decide where to focus on their policy skills. They can use interactional skills to place issues on the agendas and of decision makers, and they can use value clarifying skills when they seek a preferred position for a specific problem and policy deliberations. So this is it for this week. I thank you for listening to this presentation. I hope you have a great week.